Hello, hello. This is Jessie's Gamer Girl, ASMR, and today we are going to be doing Minecraft and stories. I'm hoping maybe we'll make this a common theme, but we'll see how this video goes. I tried to record me building the house that you'll kind of see at the end of the video, and the computer I'm on completely lost the entire recording, which is why we didn't have a video last weekend. So I do apologize about that. I will eventually get the hang of all this. I'm trying to learn video editing too, which is why this video came out a little later than I was expecting it to. But we will get there, and we will get better and better and better. Just remember to try your best. So today we are going to be building a greenhouse in our snowy resort. And I just have a forewarning for you guys. I probably won't explain much about this. I build in a very weird way. I start building, I get distracted, then I build another part, then I get undistracted, go back to that other part. Anyway, there is no thought process. I didn't pre-plan this build in a creative world. This is the creative world, so this is just based on whatever design I want it to be. If you guys ever have any questions, just let me know. I am using some shaders, and I will link those down in the comments. Just the one shader, really. And if you guys have any questions, please let me know. We are going to start off with a very special book that's very near and dear to my heart. And then we are going to read a second book, which is like a little off, like one of the library books that they found in Harry Potter. But we'll go over that as we read them together. I hope you guys really enjoy this. This very special book is quite literally called You Are Special. Okay, let's go. You Are Special by Max Lucado. The Wemmicks were small wooden people. All of the wooden people were carved by a woodworker named Eli. His workshop sat on a hill overlooking their village. Each Wemmick was different. Some had big noses, others had large eyes. Some were tall, and others were short. Some wore hats, others wore coats, but all were made by the same carver. All lived in the village. And all day, every day, the Wemmicks did the same thing. They gave each other stickers. Each Wemmick had a box of golden star stickers and a box of gray dot stickers. Up and down the streets all over the city, people spent their days sticking stars or dots on one another. The pretty ones, those with smooth wood and fine paint, always got stars. But if the wood was rough or the paint chipped, the Wemmicks gave dots. The talented ones got stars too. Some could lift big sticks high above their heads or jump over tall boxes. Still, others knew big words or could sing pretty songs. Everyone gave them stars. Some Wemmicks had stars all over them. Every time they got a star, it made them feel so good. It made them want to do something else and get another star. Others, though, could do little. They got dots. Punchinello was one of these. He tried to jump high like the others, but he always fell. and when he fell, the others would gather around him and give him dots. Sometimes when he fell, his wood got scratched, so the people would give him more dots. Then, when he would try to explain why he fell, he would say something silly, and the Wemmicks would give him more dots. After a while, he had so many dots that he didn't want to go outside. He was afraid he would do something dumb, such as forget his hat or step in the water, and then people would give him another dot. In fact, he had so many gray dots that some people would come up and give him one for no reason at all. He deserves lots of dots, the wooden people would agree with one another. He's not a good wooden person. After a while, Punchinello believed them. I'm not a good Wemmick, he would say. The few times he went outside, he hung around other Wemmicks who had a lot of dots. He felt better around them. One day, he met a Wemmick who was unlike any he'd ever met. She had no dots or stars. She was just wooden. Her name was Lucia. It wasn't that people didn't try to give her stickers. It's just that the stickers didn't stick. Some of the Wemmicks admired Lucia for having no dots, so they would run up and give her a star. But it would fall off. Others would look down on her for having no stars, so they would give her a dot, but it wouldn't stay either. That's the way I want to be, thought Punchinello. I don't want anyone's marks. So he asked the stickerless Wemmick how she did it. It's easy, Lucia replied. Every day I go see Eli. Eli, the wood carver. I sit in the workshop with him. Why? Why don't you find out for yourself? Go up the hill. He's there. And with that, the Wemmick who had no stickers turned and skipped away. But will he want to see me? Punchinello cried out. Lucia didn't hear, so Punchinello went home. He sat near a window and watched the wooden people as they scurried around, giving each other stars and dots. It's not right, he muttered to himself. He decided to go see Eli. He walked up the narrow path to the top of the hill and stepped into the big shop. His wooden eyes widened at the size of everything. The stool was as tall as he was. He had to stretch on his tiptoes to see the top of the workbench. A hammer was as long as his arm. Punchinello swallowed hard. I'm not staying here. And he turned to leave. Then he heard his name. Punchinello. The voice was deep and strong. Punchinello stopped. Punchinello, how good to see you. Come and let me have a look at you. Punchinello turned slowly and looked at the large bearded wood craftsman. You know my name? The little Wemmick asked. Of course I do. I made you. Eli stooped down and picked him up and set him on the bench. The maker spoke thoughtfully as he looked at the gray dots. Looks like you've been given some bad marks. Looks like you've been given some bad marks. I didn't mean to, Eli. I tried really hard. Oh, you don't have to defend yourself to me, child. I don't care what the other Wemmicks think. You don't? No, and you shouldn't either. Who are they to give stars or dots? They're Wemmicks, just like you. What they think doesn't matter. Punchinello, all that matters is what I think, and I think you are pretty special. Punchinella laughed. Me? Special? Why? I can't walk fast. I can't jump. My paint is peeling. Why do I matter to you? Eli looked at Punchinella, put his hands on those small wooden shoulders, and spoke very slowly. Because you're mine. That's why you matter to me. Punchinello had never had anyone look at him like this, much less his maker. He didn't know what to say. Every day I've been hoping you'd come, Eli explained. I came because I met someone who had no marks, said Punchinello. I know. She told me about you. Why don't the stickers stay on her? The maker spoke softly. Because she has decided that what I think is more important than what they think. The stickers only stick if you let them. What? The stickers only stick if they matter to you. The more you trust my love, the less you care about their stickers. I'm not sure I understand. Eli smiled. You will, but it will take time. You've got a lot of marks. For now, just come to see me every day and let me remind you of how much I care. Eli lifted Punchinello off the bench and set him on the ground. Remember, Eli said as the Wemmick walked out the door, you are special because I made you, and I don't make mistakes. Punchinello didn't stop, but in his heart he thought, I think he really means it. And when he did, a dot fell to the ground. The end. Now, this was made in a religious sense, but even if you don't believe in religion, it has a good message. If you don't care about what the others think about you, and you do what makes you happy, and remember that you are special, there won't be gray dots that stick to you. You won't care what others think, and you'll be very happy. Now I have a different book for us to read. It's a book I found in my bookshelf, so I'm not sure if it's going to be any good, but it should be because it's written by J.K. Rowling. It's called The Tales of Beedle the Bard. It's from Harry Potter, but I think it's like a book that they find on the shelf. And J.K. Rowling wrote like a spin-off of it, so this should be good. Okay, so I'll tell you what the title of each story is. So the first one's going to be The Wizard and the Hopping Pot. So we'll read the introduction version first. The Tales of Beedle the Bard is a collection of stories written for young wizards and witches. They have been popular bedtime reading for centuries, with the result that the hopping pot and the fountain of fair fortune are as familiar to many of the students at Hogwarts as Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty are to Muggle, non-magical children. Beedle's story resembles our fairy tales in many respects. For instance, virtue is usually rewarded and wickedness punished. However, there is a very obvious difference in Muggle fairy tales. Magic tends to lie at the root of the hero's or heroine's troubles. The wicked witch has poisoned the apple, or put the princess in 100-year sleep, or turned the prince into a hideous beast. In the tales of Beedle the Bard, on the other hand, we meet heroes and heroines who can perform magic themselves, and yet find it just as hard to solve their problems as we do. Beedle stories have helped generations of wizarding parents to explain this painful fact of life to their young children, that that magic causes as much trouble as it cures. Another notable difference between these fables and their Muggle counterparts is that Beedle's witches are much more active in seeking their fortune than our fairy tale heroines. Asha, Altheda, Amada, and Babbity Rabbity are all witches who take their fates into their own hands rather than taking a prolonged nap or waiting for someone to return a lost shoe. The exception to this rule, the unnamed maiden of the Warlock's hairy heart, acts more like our idea of a storybook princess, but there is no happily ever after at the end of her tale. Beedle the Bard lived in the 15th century, and much of his life remains shrouded in mystery. We know that he was born in Yorkshire. The only surviving woodcut shows that he had an exceptionally luxuriant beard. If his stories accurately reflect his opinions, he rather liked muggles, whom he regarded as ignorant rather than malevolent. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. He mistrusted dark magic, and he believed that the worst excess of wizard kind sprang from the all-too-human traits of cruelty, apathy, or arrogant misapplication of their own talents. The heroes and heroines who triumph in his stories are not those with the most powerful magic, but rather those who demonstrate the most kindness, common sense, and ingenuity. One modern-day wizard who held very similar views was, of course, Professor Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Supreme Mugwump of International Confederation of Wizards, and Chief Warlock of the Wizened Gamut. This similarity of outlook notwithstanding, it was a surprise to discover a set of notes on the tales of Beedle the Bard among the many papers that Dumbledore left in his will to the Hogwarts archives. Whether this commentary was written for his own satisfaction or for future publication, we shall never know. However, we have been graciously granted permission by Professor Minerva McGonagall, now headmistress of Hogwarts, to print Professor Dumbledore's notes here, alongside a brand new translation of the tales of Hermione Granger. We hope that Professor Dumbledore's insights, which include observations on wizarding history, personal reminiscences, and enlightening information on key elements of each story, will help a new generation of both wizarding and Muggle readers appreciate the tales of Beedle the Bard. It is the belief of all those who knew him personally that Professor Dumbledore would have been delighted to lend his support to this project, given that all royalties are to be donated to the Children's High-Level Group, which works to benefit children in despair and desperate need of a voice. It seems only right to make one small comment on Professor Dumbledore's notes. As far as we can tell, the notes were completed around 18 months before the tragic events that took place at the top of Hogwarts Astronomy Tower. Those familiar with the history of the most recent Wizarding War, everyone who has read all 7 volumes of The Life of Harry Potter, for instance, will be aware that Professor Dumbledore reveals a little less than he knows or suspects about the final story in this book. The reason for any omissions lies, perhaps, in what Dumbledore said about truth many years ago to his favorite and most famous pupil. It is a beautiful and terrible thing, and should therefore be treated with great caution. Whether we agree with him or not, we can perhaps excuse Professor Dumbledore for wishing to protect future readers from the temptations to which he himself had fallen prey, for which he paid so terrible a price. J.K. Rowling, 2008. Okay. The Tales of Beedle the Bard. The Wizard and the Hopping Pot. There was once a kindly old wizard who used his magic generously and wisely for the benefit of his neighbors. Rather than reveal the true source of his power, he pretended that his potions, charms, and antidotes sprang ready-made from the little cauldron he called his lucky cooking pot. From miles around, people came to him with their troubles, and the wizard was pleased to give his pot a stir and put things right. This well-beloved wizard lived to a goodly age, then died, leaving all his chattels to his only son. This son was of a very different disposition to his gentle father. Those who could not work magic were, to the son's mind, worthless, and he had often quarreled with his father's habits of dispensing magical aid to their neighbors. Upon the father's death, the son found hidden inside the old cooking pot a small package bearing his name. He opened it, hoping for gold, but it found instead a soft, thick slipper, much too small to wear, and with no pair. A fragment of parchment within the slipper bore the words, "In the fond hope, my son, that you will never need it." The son cursed his father's aged, softened mind, then threw the slipper back into the cauldron, resolving to use it henceforth as a rubbish pail. That very night, a peasant woman knocked on the front door. "My granddaughter is afflicted by a crop of warts, sir," she told him. "Your father used to mix a special poultice in that cooking pot." "Begone," cried the son. "What care I for your brat's warts?" And he slammed the door in the old woman's face. At once there came a loud clanging and banging from his kitchen. The wizard lit his wand, opened the door, and there, to his amazement, he saw his father's old cooking pot. It had sprouted a single foot of brass, and hopping on the spot in the middle of the floor, making a fearful noise upon the flagstones. The wizard approached it in wonder, but fell back hurriedly when he saw that the whole of the pot's surface was covered in warts. "Disgusting object," he cried, and he tried firstly to vanish the pot, then to clean it by magic, and finally to force it out of the house. None of his spells worked, however, and he was unable to prevent the pot hopping after him out of the kitchen, and then following him up to the bed, clanging and banging loudly on every wooden stair. The wizard could not sleep all night for the banging of the warty old pot by his bedside, and next morning the pot insisted upon hopping after him to the breakfast table. Clang, 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 clang went the brass-footed pot, and the wizard had not even started his porridge when there came another knock on the door. An old man stood on the doorstep. "'Tis my old donkey, sir," he explained. "Lost she is, or stolen, and without her I cannot take my wares to market, and my family will go hungry tonight." "And I am hungry now," roared the wizard, and he slammed the door upon the old man. Clang, clang, clang went the cooking pot's single brass foot upon the floor, but now its clamor was mixed with the bray of donkeys and human groans of hunger, echoing from the depths of the pot. "Be still! Be silent!" shrieked the wizard, but not all his magical powers could quieten the warty pot, which hopped at his heels all day, braying and groaning and clanging, no matter where he went or what he did. That evening there came a third knock upon the door, and there on the threshold stood a young woman sobbing as her heart would break. "My baby is grievously ill," she said. "Won't you please help us? Your father bade me come if troubled, but the wizard slammed the door on her. And now the tormenting pot filled to the brim with salt water and slopped tears all over the floor as it hopped and brayed and groaned and sprouted more warts. Though no more villagers came to seek help at the wizard's cottage for the rest of the week, the pot kept him informed of their many ills. Within a few days it was not only braying and groaning and slopping and hopping and sprouting warts, it was also choking and retching, crying like a baby, whining like a dog, and spewing out bad cheese and sour milk, and a plague of hungry slugs. The wizard could not sleep or eat with the pot beside him, but the pot refused to leave, and he could not silence it or force it to be still. At last the wizard could bear it no more. "Bring me all your problems, all your troubles, and all your woes," he screamed, fleeing into the night with the pot hopping behind him along the road to the village. "Come, let me cure you, mend you, and comfort you. I have my father's cooking pot, and I shall make you well." And with the foul pot still bounding along behind him, he ran up the street, casting spells in every direction. Inside one house, the little girl's warts vanished as she slept. The lost donkey was summoned from a distant briar patch and set down softly in its stable. The sick baby was doused in dittany and woke well and rosy. At every house of sickness and sorrow the wizard did his best, and gradually the cooking pot beside him stopped groaning and retching, and became quiet, shiny, and clean. "Well, pot?" asked the trembling wizard as the sun began to rise. The pot burped out the single slipper he had thrown into it, and permitted him to fit it onto the brass foot. Together they set off back to the wizard's house, the pot's footsteps muffled at last. But from that day forward, the wizard helped the villagers, just like his father before him, lest the pot cast off its slipper and began to hop once more. So these were Dumbledore's notes on this. A kind old wizard decides to teach his hard-hearted son a lesson by giving him a taste of the local muggle's misery. The young wizard's conscience awakes, and he agrees to use his magic for the benefit of his non-magical neighbors. A simple and heartwarming fable, one might think, in which case one would reveal oneself to be an innocent nincompoop. A pro-muggle story showing a muggle-loving father as superior in magic to muggle-hating son. It is nothing short of amazing that any copies of the original version of this tale survived the flames to which they were so often consigned. Beedle was somewhat out of step with his times in preaching a message of brotherly love for muggles. The persecution of witches and wizards was gathering pace all over Europe in the early 15th century. Many in the magical community felt, and with good reason, that offering to cast a spell on the muggle's next door's sickly pig was tantamount to volunteering to fetch the firewood for one's own funeral pyre. "Let the muggles manage without us," was the cry as wizards drew further and further apart from their non-magical brethren, culminating with the institution of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy in 1689, when wizardkind voluntarily went underground. Children being children, however, the grotesque hopping pot had taken hold of their imaginations. The solution was to jettison the pro-muggle morale, but to keep the warty cauldron so, by the middle of the 16th century, a different version of the tale was in wide circulation among wizarding families. In the revised story, the hopping pot protects an innocent wizard from his torch-bearing, pitchfork-toting neighbors by chasing them away from the wizard's cottage catching them and swallowing them whole. At the end of the story, by which time the pot has consumed most of his neighbors, the wizard gains a promise from the few remaining villagers that he will be left in peace to practice magic. In return, he instructs the pot to render up its victims, who are duly burped out of its depths, slightly mangled to this day. Some wizarding children are only told the revised version of the story by their generally anti-muggle parents, and the original, if and when they ever read it, comes as a great surprise. As I have already hinted, however, its pro-muggle sentiment was not the only reason that the wizard and the hopping pot attracted anger. As the witch hunts grew ever fiercer, wizarding families began to live double lives, using charms of concealment to protect themselves and their family. By the 17th century, any witch or wizard who chose to fraternize with muggles became suspect, even an outcast in his or her own community. Among the many insults hurled at pro-muggle witches and wizards, such as fruity epithets as mud wallower, dung licker, and scum sucker, date from this period, was the charge of having weak or inferior magic. Influential wizards of the day, such as Brutus Malfoy, editor of Warlock at War, an anti-muggle periodical, perpetuated the stereotype that a muggle lover was about as magical as a squib. In 1675, Brutus wrote, "This we may state with certainty. Any wizard who shows fondness for the society of muggles is of low intelligence, with magic so feeble and pitiful that he can only feel himself superior if surrounded by muggle pigmen. Nothing is a surer sign of weak magic than a weakness for non-magical company." This prejudice eventually died out in the face of overwhelming evidence that some of the world's most brilliant wizards were, to use the common phrase, muggle lovers. The final objection to the wizard and the hopping pot remains alive in certain quarters today. It was summed up best by Beatrix Bloxham, author of the infamous Toadstool Tales. Mrs. Bloxham believed that the tales of Beedle the Bard were damaging to children because of what she called their unhealthy preoccupation with the most horrid subjects such as death, disease, bloodshed, wicked magic, unwholesome characters, and bodily effusions and eruptions of the most disgusting kind. Mrs. Bloxham took a variety of old stories, including several of Beedle's, and rewrote them according to her ideals, which she expressed as filling the pure minds of our little angels with healthy, happy thoughts, keeping their sweet slumber free of wicked dreams and protecting the precious flower of their innocence. The final paragraph of Mrs. Bloxham's pure and precious reworking of The Wizard and the Hopping Pot reads, "Then the little gold pot danced with the delight. Hoppity hoppity hop. On its tiny rosy toes, wee Willikins had cured all the dollies of their poor tum-tums. And the little pot was so happy that it filled up with the sweets for wee Willikins and their dollies. But don't forget to brush your teethy pegs," cried the pot, and wee Willikins kissed and hugged the hoppity pot and promised always to help the dollies and never to be a grumpy wumpkins again. Mrs. Bloxham's tale has met the same response from the generations of wizarding children: uncontrollable retching, followed by an immediate demand to have the book taken from them and mashed into pulp. Well, that's a bit of a strong reaction. Okay, next we will read The Fountain of Fair Fortune. High on a hill, in an enchanted garden, enclosed by tall walls and protected by strong magic, flowed the Fountain of Fair Fortune. Once a year, between the hours of sunrise and sunset on the longest day, a single unfortunate was given the chance to fight their way to the fairy fountain, bathe in its waters, and receive fair fortune forevermore. On the appointed day, hundreds of people traveled from all over the kingdom to reach the garden walls before dawn, male and female, rich and poor, young and old, of magical means and without. They gathered in the darkness, each hoping that they would be the one to gain entrance to the garden. 3 witches, each with her burden of woe, met on the outskirts of the crowd and told one another their sorrows as they waited for sunrise. The first, by name Asha, was sick of malady no healer could cure. She hoped that the fountain would banish her symptoms and grant her a long and happy life. The second one, named Altheda, had been robbed of her home, her gold, and her wand by an evil sorcerer. She hoped that the fountain might relieve her of powerlessness and poverty. The third, by name Amada, had been deserted by a man whom she loved dearly, and she thought her heart would never mend. She hoped that the fountain would relieve her of her grief and longing. Pitying each other, the 3 women agreed that should the chance befall them, they would unite and try to reach the fountain together. The sky was rent with the first ray of sun, and a chink of the wall opened. The crowd surged forward, each of them shrieking their claim for the fountain's benison. Creepers from the garden beyond snaked through the pressing mass and twisted themselves around the first witch, Asha. She grabbed the wrist of the second witch, Altheda, who seized tight upon the robes of the third witch, Amada. And Amada caught upon the armor of a dismal-looking knight who was seated on a bone-thin horse. The creepers tugged the 3 witches through the chink in the wall, and the knight was dragged off his steed after them. The furious screams of the disappointed throng rose up upon the morning air, then fell silent as the garden walls sealed once more. Asha and Altheda were angry with Amada, who had accidentally brought along the knight. Only one can bathe in the fountain. It will be hard enough to decide which of us it will be, without adding another. Now Sir Luckless, as the knight was known, in the hill outside the walls, observed that these were witches, and having no magic, nor any great skill at jousting or dueling with swords, nor anything that distinguished the non-magical man, was sure that he had no hope of beating the 3 women to the fountain. He therefore declared his intention of withdrawing outside the walls again. At this, Amada became angry too. Faint heart, she chided him. Draw your sword, knight, and help us reach our goal. And so the 3 witches and the forlorn knight ventured forth into the enchanted garden, where rare herbs, fruit, and flowers grew in abundance on either side of the sunlit paths. They met no obstacle until they reached the foot of the hill on which the fountain stood. There, however, wrapped around the base of the hill, was a monstrous white worm, bloated and blind. At their approach, it turned a foul face upon them and uttered the following words: "Pay me the proof of your pain." Sir Luckless drew his sword and attempted to kill the beast, but his blade snapped. Then Altheda cast rocks at the worm, while Asha and Amada essayed every spell that might subdue or entrance it. But the power of their wands was no more effective than their friends' stones or the knight's steel. The worm would not let them pass. The sun rose higher and higher in the sky, and Asha, despairing, began to weep. Then the great worm placed its face upon hers and drank the tears from her cheeks. its thirst assuaged, the worm slithered aside and vanished into a hole in the ground. Rejoicing at the worm's disappearance, the three witches and the knight began to climb the hill, sure that they would reach the fountain before noon. Halfway up the steep slope, however, they came across the words cut into the ground before them. "Pay me the fruit of your labors." Sir Luckless took out his only coin, placed it upon the grassy hillside, but it rolled away and was lost. The three witches and the knight continued to climb, but though they walked for hours more, they advanced not a step. The summit came no nearer, and still the inscription lay in the earth before them. All were discouraged as the sun rose over their heads and began to sink toward the far horizon. But Althea walked faster and harder than any of them, and exhorted the others to follow her example, though she moved no further up the enchanted hill. "Courage, friends, and do not yield," she cried, wiping the sweat from her brow. As the drops fell glittering onto the earth, the inscription blocking their path vanished, and they found that they were able to move upward once more. Delighted by the removal of the second obstacle, they hurried toward the summit as fast as they could, until at last they glimpsed the fountain, glittering like crystal in a bower of flowers and trees. Before they could reach it, however, they came to a stream that ran around the hilltop, barring their way. In the depths of the clear water lay a smooth stone, bearing the words, "Pay me the treasure of your past." Sir Luckless attempted to float across the stream on his shield, but it sank. The three witches pulled him from the water, then tried to leap the brook themselves, but it would not let them cross, and all the while the sun was sinking lower in the sky. So they fell to pondering the meaning of the stone's message, and Amada was the first to understand. Taking her wand, she drew from her mind all the memories of happy times she had spent with her vanished lover, and dropped them into the rushing waters. The stream swept them away, and stepping stones appeared, and the three witches and the knight were able to pass at last onto the summit of the hill. The fountain shimmered before them, set amidst herbs and flowers, rarer and more beautiful than any they had yet seen. The sky burned ruby, and it was time to decide which of them would bathe. Before they could make their decision, however, frail Asha fell to the ground, exhausted by their struggle to the summit. She was close to death. Her three friends would have carried her to the fountain, but Asha was in mortal agony and begged them not to touch her. Then Althea hastened to pick all those herbs she thought most helpful and mixed them in Sir Luckless' gourd of water and poured the potion into Asha's mouth. At once Asha was able to stand. What was more, all symptoms of her dread malady had vanished. "I am cured," she cried. "I have no need of the fountain. Let Althea bathe." But Althea was busy collecting more herbs in her apron. "If I can cure this disease, I shall earn gold aplenty. Let Amada bathe." Sir Luckless bowed and gestured Amada toward the fountain, but she shook her head. The stream had washed away all regret for her lover, and she saw now that he had been cruel and faithless, and that it was happiness enough to be rid of him. "Good sir, you must bathe as a reward for all your chivalry," as she told Sir Luckless. So the knight clanked forth in the last rays of the setting sun, and bathed in the fountain of fair fortune, astonished that he was the chosen one of hundreds, and giddy with his incredible luck. As the sun fell below the horizon, Sir Luckless emerged from the waters with the glory of triumph upon him, and flung himself in his rusted armor at the feet of Amata, who was the kindest and most beautiful woman he had ever beheld. Flushed with success, he begged for her hand and her heart, and Amata, no less delighted, realized that she had found a man worthy of them. The three witches and the knight set off down the hill together, arm in arm, and all four led long and happy lives, and none of them ever knew or suspected that the fountain's waters carried no enchantment at all. Oh, plot twist. Oh, that's crazy. Okay. These were Dumbledore's thoughts on the Fountain of Fair Fortune. The Fountain of Fair Fortune is a perennial favorite, so much so that it was the subject of the sole attempt to introduce a Christmas pantomime to Hogwarts festive celebrations. Our then herbology master, Professor Herbert Beery, an enthusiastic devotee of amateur dramatics, proposed an adaptation of this well-beloved children's tale as a Yuletide treat for staffs and students. I was then a young Transfiguration teacher, and Herbert assigned to me to special effects, which included providing a fully functioning Fountain of Fair Fortune and a miniature grassy hill up which our three heroines and hero would appear to march, while it sank slowly into the stage out of sight. I think I may say, without vanity, that both my fountain and my hill performed the parts allotted to them, with simple goodwill. Alas, that the same could not be said of the rest of the cast, ignoring for a moment the antics of the gigantic worm, provided by our care of magical creatures teacher, Professor Sylvanus Kettleburn. The human element proved disastrous to the show. Professor Barry, in this role of director, had been dangerously oblivious to the emotional entanglements seething under his very nose. Little did he know that the students playing Amata and Sir Luckless had been indeed boyfriend and girlfriend until 1 hour before the curtain rose, at which point Sir Luckless transferred his affections to Asha. Suffice it to say that our seekers after fair fortune never made it to the top of the hill. The curtain had barely risen when Professor Kettleburn's worm, now revealed to be an ashwinder with an engorgement charm upon it, exploded in a shower of hot sparks and dust, filling the great hall with smoke and fragments of scenery, while the enormous fiery eggs it had laid at the foot of my hill ignited the floorboards. Amata and Asha turned upon each other, dueling so fiercely that Professor Beery was caught in the crossfire, and the staff had to evacuate the hall, as the inferno now raging on stage threatened to engulf the place. The night's entertainment concluded with a packed hospital wing. It was several months before the great hall lost its pungent aroma of wood smoke, and even longer before Professor Beery's head resumed its normal proportions, and Professor Kettleburn was taken off probation. Headmaster Armando Dippet imposed a blanket ban of future pantomimes, a proud non-theatrical tradition that Hogwarts continues to this day. Our dramatic fiasco, notwithstanding the Fountain of Fair Fortune, is probably the most popular of Beedle's tales, although just like the Wizard and the Hopping Pot, it has its detractors. More than one parent has demanded the removal of this particular tale from the Hogwarts library, including, by coincidence, a descendant of Brutus Malfoy, and at one time, member of the Hogwarts Board of Governors, Mr. Lucius Malfoy. Mr. Malfoy submitted his demand for a ban on the story in writing. Any work of fiction or non-fiction that depicts interbreeding between wizards and muggles should be banned from the bookshelves of Hogwarts. I do not wish my son to be influenced into sullying the purity of his bloodline by reading stories that promote wizard-muggle marriage. Oh, I did not read that nearly more. Oh, high-nosed. Enough. My refusal to remove the book from the library was backed by a majority of the Board of Governors. I wrote back to Mr. Malfoy, explaining my decision. So-called pure-blood families maintain their alleged purity by disowning, banishing, or lying about muggles or muggle-borns on their family trees. They then attempt to foist their hypocrisy upon the rest of us by asking us to ban works dealing with the truths that they deny. There is not a witch or wizard in existence whose blood has not mingled with that of muggles, and I should therefore consider it both illogical and immoral to remove works dealing with the subject from our students' store of knowledge. This exchange marked the beginning of Mr. Malfoy's long campaign to have me removed from my post as headmaster of Hogwarts, and of mine to have him removed from his position as Lord Voldemort's favorite Death Eater. Dumbledore has some serious clapback, I'm just telling you. Okay, the Warlock's hairy heart. There was once a handsome, rich, and talented young warlock who observed that his friends who grew foolish when they fell in love, gambling and preening, losing their appetites and their dignity, the young warlock resolved never to fall prey to such weaknesses, and employed dark arts to ensure his immunity. Unaware of his secret, the warlock's family laughed to see him so aloof and cold. All will change, they prophesied, when a maid catches his fancy. But the young warlock's fancy remained untouched. Though many a maiden was intrigued by his haughty mien and employed her most subtle arts to please him, none succeeded in touching his heart. The warlock gloried in his indifference and the sagacity that had produced it. The first freshness of youth waned, and the warlock's peers began to wed, and then to bring forth children. Their hearts must be husks, he sneered inwardly as he observed the antics of the young parents around him, shriveled by the demands of these mewling offspring. And once again he congratulated himself upon the wisdom of his early choice. In due course, the warlock's aged parents died. Their son did not mourn them. On the contrary, he considered himself blessed by their demise. Now he reigned alone in their castle, having transferred his greatest treasure to the deepest dungeon. He gave himself over to a life of ease and plenty, his comfort the only aim of his many servants. The warlock was sure that he must be an object of immense envy to all who beheld all his splendid and untroubled solitude. Fierce were his anger and chagrin. Therefore, when he overheard two of his lackeys discussing their master one day, the first servant expressed pity for the warlock, who, with all his wealth and power, was yet beloved by nobody. But his companion jeered, asking why a man with so much gold and a palatial castle to his name had been unable to attract a wife. Their words dealt dreadful blows to the listening warlock's pride. He resolved at once to take a wife, and that she would be a wife superior to all others. She would possess astounding beauty, exciting envy, and desire in every man who beheld her. She would spring from magical lineage, so that their offspring would inherit outstanding magical gifts, and she would have wealth at least equal to his own, so that his comfortable existence would be assured, in spite of additions to his household. It might have taken the warlock 50 years to find such a woman, yet it happened that the very day after he decided to seek her, a maiden answering his every wish arrived in the neighborhood to visit her kinsfolk. She was a witch of prodigious skill and possessed of much gold. Her beauty was such that it tugged at the heart of every man who set eyes on her, of every man, that is, except one. The warlock's heart felt nothing at all. Nevertheless, she was the price he sought, so he began to pay her court. All who noted the warlock's change in manners were amazed, and told the maiden that she had succeeded where 100 had failed. The young woman herself was both fascinated and repelled by the warlock's attentions. She sensed the coldness that lay behind the warmth of his flattery, and had never met a man so strange and remote. Her kinsfolk, however, deemed theirs a most suitable match, and eager to promote it, accepted the warlock's invitation to a great feast in the maiden's honor. The table was laden with silver and gold, bearing the finest wines and most sumptuous foods. Minstrels strummed on a silk-stringed lutes and sang of love their master had never felt. The maiden sat upon a throne beside the warlock, who spake low, employing the words of tenderness he had stolen from the poets, without any idea of their true meaning. The maiden listened, puzzled, and finally replied, "You speak well, warlock, and I would be delighted by your attentions, if only I thought I had your heart." Oh, she got him good. The warlock smiled and told her that she need not fear on that score. Bidding her follow, he led her from the feast and down to the locked dungeon where he kept his greatest treasure. Here, in an enchanted crystal casket, was the warlock's beating heart. Long since disconnected from eyes, ears, and fingers, it had never fallen prey to beauty or to a musical voice, to the feel of silken skin. The maiden was terrified by the sight of it, for the heart was shrunken and covered in long black hair. "Oh, what have you done?" she lamented. "Put it back where it belongs, I beseech you." Seeking that this was necessary to please her, the warlock drew his hand, unlocked the crystal casket, sliced open his own breast, and replaced the hairy heart in the empty cavity it had once occupied. "Now you are healed and will know true love," cried the maiden, and she embraced him. The touch of her soft white arms, the sound of her breath in his ear, the scent of her heavy golden hair, all pierced the newly awakened heart like spears. But it had grown strange during its long exile, blind and savage in the darkness to which it had been condemned, and its appetites had grown powerful and perverse. The guests at the feast had noticed the absence of their host and the maiden. At first untroubled, they grew anxious as the hours passed, and finally began to search the castle. They found the dungeon at last, and a most dreadful sight awaited them there. The maiden lay dead upon the floor, and her breast cut open, and beside her crouched the mad warlock, holding in one bloody hand a great, smooth, shining scarlet heart, which he licked and stroked, vowing to exchange it for his own. In his other hand he held his wand, trying to coax from his own chest the shriveled hairy heart, but the hairy heart was stronger than he was, and refused to relinquish its hold upon his senses, or to return to the coffin in which it had been locked for so long. Before the horror-struck eyes of his guests, the warlock cast aside his wand and seized a silver dagger. Vowing never to be mastered by his own heart, he hacked it from his chest. For one moment the warlock knelt triumphant, with a heart clenched in each hand. Then he fell across the maiden's body and died. Okay, these were Dumbledore's thoughts on the warlock's hairy heart. As we have already seen, Beedle's first two tales attracted criticism of their themes of generosity, tolerance, and love. The warlock's hairy heart, however, does not appear to have been modified or much criticized in the hundreds of years since it was first written. The story, as I eventually read it in the original runes, was almost exactly that which my mother had told me. That said, the warlock's hairy heart is by far the most gruesome of Beedle's offerings, and many parents do not share it with their children until they think they are old enough not to suffer nightmares. Why then the survival of this grisly tale? I would argue that the warlock's hairy heart has survived intact through the centuries because it speaks to the dark depths in all of us. It addresses one of the greatest and the least acknowledged temptations of magic, the quest for invulnerability. Of course, such a request is nothing more or less than a foolish fantasy. No man or woman alive, magical or not, has ever escaped some form of injury, whether physical, mental, or emotional. To hurt is as human as to breathe. Nevertheless, we wizards seem particularly prone to the idea that we can bend the nature of existence to our own will. The young warlock in this story, for instance, decides that falling in love would adversely affect his comfort and security. He sees love as a humiliation, a weakness, a drain on a person's emotional and material resources. Of course, the centuries-old trade in love potions shows that our fictional wizard is hardly alone in seeking to control the unpredictable course of love. The search for a true love potion continues to this day, but no such elixir has yet been created, and the leading potioneers doubt that it is possible. The hero in this tale, however, is not even interested in a simulacrum of love that he can create or destroy at will. He wants to remain forever uninfected by what he regards as a kind of sickness, and therefore performs a piece of dark magic that would not be possible outside of a storybook. He locks away his own heart. The resemblance of this action to the creation of a Horcrux has been noted by many writers. Although Beedle's hero is not seeking to avoid death, he is dividing what was clearly not meant to be divided, body and heart, rather than soul. And in doing so, he is falling foul to the first of Adalbert's Waffling's fundamental laws of magic: tamper with the deepest mysteries, the source of life, the essence of self, only if prepared for consequences of the most extreme and dangerous kind. And sure enough, in seeking to become superhuman, this foolhardy young man renders himself inhuman. The heart is locked away, slowly shrivels and grows hair, symbolizing his own descent to beasthood. He is finally reduced to a violent animal who takes what he wants by force, and he dies in a futile attempt to regain what is now forever beyond his reach. A human heart, though somewhat dated. The expression "to have a hairy heart" has passed into everyday wizarding language to describe a cold or unfeeling witch or wizard. My maiden aunt Honoria always alleged that she called off her engagement to a wizard in the improper use of magic office because she discovered in time that he had a hairy heart. Okay, this is the second to last story. Babbity Rabbity and Her Cackling Stump. A long time ago, in a far-off land, there lived a foolish king who decided that he alone should have the power of magic. He therefore commanded the head of his army to form a brigade of witch hunters, and issued them a pack of ferocious black hounds. At the same time, the king caused proclamations to be read in every village and town across the land. Wanted by the king, an instructor in magic. No true witch or wizard dared volunteer for the post, for they were all in hiding from the brigade of witch hunters. However, a cunning charlatan with no magical power saw a chance of enriching himself, and arrived at the palace, claiming to be a wizard of enormous skill. The charlatan performed a few simple tricks that convinced the foolish king of his magical powers, and was immediately appointed Grand Sorcerer in Chief. the king's private magic master. The charlatan bade the king give him a large sack of gold so that he might purchase wands and other magical necessities. He also requested several large rubies to be used in the casting of curative charms and a silver chalice or two for the storing and maturing of potions. All these things the foolish king supplied. The charlatan stowed the treasure safely in his own house and returned to the palace grounds. He did not know that he was being watched by an old woman who lived in a hovel on the edge of the grounds. Her name was Babidi, and she was a washerwoman who kept the palace linen soft, fragrant, and white. Peeping from behind her drying sheets, Babidi saw the charlatan snap 2 twigs from one of the king's trees and disappear into the palace. The charlatan gave one of the twigs to the king and assured him that it was a wand of tremendous power. "It will only work, however," said the charlatan, "when you are worthy of it." Every morning, the charlatan and the foolish king walked out into the palace grounds, where they waved their wands and shouted nonsense at the sky. The charlatan was careful to perform more tricks, so that the king remained convinced of his grand sorcerer's skill and of the power of the wands that had cost him so much gold. One morning, as the charlatan and the foolish king were twirling their twigs and hopping in circles and chanting meaningless rhymes, a loud cackling reached the king's ears. Babidi the washerwoman was watching the king and the charlatan from the window of her tiny cottage, and was laughing so hard she soon sank out of sight, too weak to stand. "I must look most undignified to make the old washerwoman laugh so," said the king. He ceased his hopping and twig twirling and frowned. "I grow weary of practice. When shall I be ready to perform real spells in front of my subject sorcerer?" The charlatan tried to soothe his pupil, assuring him he would be soon capable of astonishing feats of magic. But Babidi's cackling had stung the foolish king more than the charlatan knew. "Tomorrow," said the king, "we shall invite our court to watch the king perform magic." The charlatan saw that the time had come to make his treasure, that the time had come to take his flesh treasure and flee. "Alas, your majesty, it is impossible. I had forgotten to tell your majesty that I must set out on a long journey tomorrow. If you leave this place without my permission, sorcerer, the brigade of witch hunters will hunt you down with their hounds. Tomorrow morning you will assist me to perform magic for the benefit of my lords and ladies, and if anybody laughs at me, I shall have you beheaded." The king stormed back to the palace, leaving the charlatan alone and afraid. Not all his cunning saved him now, for he could not run away, nor could he help the king with magic that neither of them knew. Seeking a vent for his fear and his anger, the charlatan approached the widow of Babidi, the washerwoman. Peering inside, he saw the little old lady sitting at her table, polishing a wand. In the corner behind her, the king's sheets were washing themselves in a wooden tub. The charlatan understood at once that Babidi was a true witch, and that she who had given him his awful problem could also solve it. "Crone," he roared the charlatan, "your cackling has cost me dear. If you fail to help me, I shall denounce you as a witch, and it will be you who is torn apart by the king's hounds." Old Babidi smiled at the charlatan and assured him that she would do everything in her power to help. The charlatan instructed her to conceal herself inside a bush while the king gave his magical display, and to perform the king's spells for him without his knowledge. Babidi agreed to the plan, but asked one question. "But sir, if the king attempts a spell Babidi cannot perform?" The charlatan scoffed. "Your magic is more than equal to that fool's imagination," he assured her, and he retired to the castle, well pleased with his own cleverness. The following morning, all the lords and ladies of the kingdom assembled in the palace grounds. The king climbed onto a stage in front of them, with the charlatan by his side. "I shall firstly make this lady's hat disappear," cried the king, pointing his twig at the noblewoman. From inside a bush nearby, Babidi pointed her wand at the hat and caused it to vanish. Great was the astonishment and admiration of the crowd, and their applause for their jubilant king. "Next I shall make that horse fly," cried the king, pointing his twig at his own steed. From inside the bush, Babidi pointed her wand at the horse, and it rose high into the air. The crowd was still more thrilled and amazed. They roared their appreciation of their magical king. "And now," said the king, looking around for an idea, and the captain of his brigade of witch hunters ran forward. "Your Majesty," said the captain, "this morning Saber died of eating a poisonous toadstool. Bring him back to life, Your Majesty, with your wand." And the captain heaved onto the stage the lifeless body of the largest of the witch-hunting hounds. The foolish king brandished his twig and pointed it at the dead dog. But inside the bush, Babidi smiled and did not trouble to lift her wand, for no magic can raise the dead. When the dog did not stir, the crowd began to first whisper and then to laugh. They suspected that the king's first 2 feats had been mere tricks after all. "Why doesn't it work?" the king screamed. The charlatan, who bethought himself of the only rules left him. "There, Your Majesty, there," he shouted, pointing at the bush where Babidi sat concealed. "I see her plain, a wicked witch who is blocking your magic with her own evil spells. Seize her. Somebody seize her." Babidi fled from a bush, and the brigade of witch hunters set off in pursuit, unleashing their hounds who bayed for Babidi's blood. But as she reached a low hedge, the little witch vanished from sight, and the king, the charlatan, and the courtiers came to the other side. They found the pack of witch-hunting hounds barking and scrambling around a bent and aged tree. "She has turned herself into a tree," screamed the charlatan, and, dreading lest Babidi turn back into an old woman and denounce him, he added, "Cut her down, Your Majesty. That is the way to treat evil witches." An axe was brought at once, and the old tree was felled to loud cheers from the courtiers and the charlatan. However, as they were making ready to return to the palace, the sound of loud cackling stopped them in their tracks. "Fools!" cried Babidi's voice from the stump they had left behind. "No witch or wizard can be killed by being cut in half. Take the axe if you do not believe me, and cut the grand sorcerer in two." The captain of the brigade of witch hunters was eager to make the experiment, but as he raised the axe, the charlatan fell to his knees, screaming for mercy and confessing all his wickedness. As he was dragged away to the dungeons, the tree stump cackled more loudly than ever. "By cutting a witch in half, you have unleashed a dreadful curse upon your kingdom," it told the petrified king. "Henceforth, every stroke of harm you inflict upon my fellow witches and wizards will feel like an axe stroke in your own side, until you will wish you could die of it." At that, the king fell to his knees too, and told the stump that he would issue a proclamation at once, protecting all the witches and wizards of the kingdoms, and allowing them to practice their magic in peace. "Very good," said the stump, "but you have not yet made amends to Babidi." "Anything, anything at all," cried the foolish king, wringing his hands before the stump. "You will erect a statue of Babidi upon me, in memory of your poor washerwoman, and to remind you forever of your own foolishness," said the stump. The king agreed to it at once, and promised to engage the foremost sculptor in the land and have the statue made of pure gold. Then the shame king and all the noblemen and women returned to the palace, leaving the tree stump cackling behind them. When the crowds were deserted once more, there wriggled from a hole between the reeds of the tree stump a stout and whiskery old rabbit, with a wand clamped between her teeth. Babidi hopped out of the grounds and far away, and ever after a golden a golden statue of the washerwoman stood upon the tree stump, and no witch or wizard was ever persecuted in the kingdom again. These were Dumbledore's thoughts on the story Babbity Rabbity and Her Cackling Stump. The story of Babbity Rabbity and Her Cackling Stump is in many ways the most real of Beedle's tales, in that the magic described in the story conforms almost entirely to known magical laws. It was through this story that many of us first discovered that magic could not bring back the dead, and a great disappointment and shock it was, convinced as we had been as young children that our parents would be able to waken our dead rats and cats with one wave of their wands. Though some 6 centuries have elapsed since Beedle wrote this tale, and while we have devised in innumerable ways of maintaining the illusion of our loved ones' continuing presence, wizards have still not found a way of reuniting body and soul once a death has occurred. As the eminent wizarding philosopher Bertrand de Pinesse Profondes writes in his celebrated work, A Study in the Possibility of Reversing the Actual and Metaphysical Effects of Natural Death, with particular regard to reintegration of essence and matter, give up. It's never going to happen. The tale of Babbity Rabbity does, however, give us one of the earliest literary mentions of an animagus, for Babbity the washerwoman is possessed of a rare magical ability to transform into an animal at will. Animagi make up a small fraction of the wizarding population. Achieving perfect, spontaneous human-to-animal transformation requires much study and practice, and many witches and wizards consider that their time might be better employed in other ways. Certainly, the application of such a talent is limited, unless one has a great need of disguise or concealment. It is for this reason that the Ministry of Magic has insisted upon a register of animagi, for there can be no doubt that this kind of magic is one of greatest of use to those engaged in surreptitious, covert, or even criminal activity. Whether there was ever a washerwoman who was able to transform into a rabbit is open to doubt. However, some magical historians have suggested that Beedle modeled Babbity on the famous French sorceress Lisette de Lapin, who was convicted of witchcraft in Paris in 1422, to the astonishment of her muggle guards, who were later tried for helping the witch escape. Lisette vanished from her prison cell the night before she was due to be executed, although it was never proven that Lisette was an animagus who managed to squeeze through the bars of her cell window. A large white rabbit was subsequently seen crossing the English Channel in a cauldron with a sail fitted to it, and a similar rabbit later became a trusted advisor at the court of King Henry VI. The king in Beedle's story is a foolish muggle who both covets and fears magic. He believes that he can become a wizard simply by learning incantations and waving a wand. He is completely ignorant of the true nature of magic, and wizards, therefore, swallows the preposterous suggestions of both the charlatan and Babbity. This is certainly typical of a particular type of muggle thinking. In their ignorance, they are prepared to accept all sorts of impossibilities about magic, including the proposition that Babbity has turned herself into a tree that can still think and talk. It is worth noting at this point, however, that while Beedle uses the talking tree device to show us how ignorant the Muggle King is, he also asks us to believe that Babbity can talk while she is a rabbit. This might be a poetic license, but I think it is more likely that Beedle had only heard about animagi and never met one, for this is the only liberty that he takes with magical laws in the story. Animagi do not retain the power of human speech while in their animal form. Although they keep all their human thinking, the reasoning powers, this as every school child knows, is the fundamental difference between being an animagus and transfiguring oneself into an animal. In the case of the latter, one would become the animal entirely, with the consequence that one would know no magic, be unaware that one had ever been a wizard, and would need someone else to transfigure one back to one's original form. I think it possible that in choosing to make this heroine pretend to turn into a tree and threaten the king with pain like an axe stroke in his own side, Beedle was inspired by real magical traditions and practices. Trees with wand quality wood have always been fiercely protected by the wand makers who tend them, and cutting down such trees to steal them risks incurring not only the malice of bowtruckles, usually nesting there, but also the ill effects of protective curses placed around them by their owners. In Beedle's time, the Cruciatus curse had not yet been made illegal by the Ministry of Magic, and could have produced precisely the sensation which Baptiste threatens the king. Alright, that was the last story that we're going to read tonight. I think that's going to be it for tonight. I hope you all really enjoyed listening to these reads. We'll read the very last tale in another video. Hopefully, I'll be able to come out soon with one. I'm kind of hoping to make this like a little snowy isolation area, so we will definitely have some more creating buildings in Minecraft. Otherwise, I'll tell you what I tell my sister every night. I love you so much, and I hope you have a good night. Good night, guys.